again, we're talking big picture of the program here, right? Like if I was talking the best calf raise, I would be like, all right, I'm just do leg press. I would say leg press calf raise with shoes on. But because I have a variation with shoes on with the seated, take the shoes off, get some more mobility through the foot, and we're able to sort of temper our overall output by making that consideration. So when we look at lunges for the quads, we're going to look at glute and hamstring, et cetera. And we're going to see where we're going to fill in the gap. So if we go from quad to hamstring, given the rest of the exercises I'm going to choose, I think I'm going to go seated hamstring curl second. So seated hamstring curl, it's machine, high output, length and position. It's going to allow you to target the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. So it actually helps improve or could potentially help improve tibial internal rotation as well. So there's just a lot of wins with this exercise. And if you want to, big fuck off hamstrings that are good and strong, find yourself a seated hamstring curl, because there's a couple of reasons, and I'm thinking a few steps ahead here. So before we kind of go like, whoa, seated hamstring curl, what about hinges? I think for the glute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a contralaterally loaded B-stance dumbbell RDL. This is sort of a junta special. I guarantee you Jay's going to have this on his list. But so we got kind of a kickstand RDL. Now here's the kicker, no pun intended. We need to make sure the shin of the loaded leg stays vertical. I see this trend in hinging that just becomes this balancing act where people rock back onto their heels. So shin angle, right? So the angle in which the foot, the shin leaves the talus. If we don't keep that straight and we're going back into our heels, we're just sort of creating this arbitrary load. We're not in a good position to produce force because our center of mass is too far backwards. So we're sort of relying on the weight to counterbalance us. And this is something that I see really often with the B-stance RDL, where people go to hinge and their knee comes backwards, the shin angle goes negative, and they get it out of the glute. They move that tension sort of into this lengthening of the hamstring as their center of mass is too far back. We want to keep the pressure over our midfoot the entire time so our shin stays more or less vertical and may even come forward a little bit at the end. Like I want you to think, if you were to draw, and if you're following along at home on YouTube, I highly suggest it. This has got to be like the best looking video recording we've had to date. So check out the movement online, because we're really doing things, Jay Marsh and I, on the quality of the podcast. So head on over to YouTube. I think it's on the Muscle Doc. At the Muscle Doc on YouTube. Subscribe and do all that stuff. But when we're doing the B-stance RDL, and if you're following along at home, and it may be useful to do so, is you want to think of like the planes of motion, right? Like if you think of how they decipher sagittal and frontal or coronal, depending on where you're from, and transverse plane, I want you to think of drawing like an ellipsis or like an orbit. And I want you to think of moving through that orbit. So, the frontal plane, sort of like when you learn it in school, like the coronal plane, is if I was moving through the coronal plane, I'd be moving through this field that divides my ears in half. So that's adduction, lateral flexion. And then we have if I'm moving within the sagittal plane, I have this thing that kind of like cuts my nose in half and my face in half through my nose. And it's like now I'm moving through the sagittal plane. When I think about the fiber orientation of the glute and the kickstand RDL, it's like I'm moving through a plane that exists between, if I had this imaginary line that kind of like chopped my body in half front to back, and I moved within this plane, like some sort of laser field that I disrupted, and I moved through the laser field, like within the dimension. Again, you're going to see me on the internet and I'm going to look like I'm doing some I'm a little teapot thing. And the sagittal plane would be the same. Like I had this line that runs through and I'm moving through that line. The line that I'm moving through with a B-stance RDL is almost on like a 45 degree of that sagittal line and that transverse line. And it's going to have an expression of both, because I think of like the thumb web of my hand and the arch of my foot being connected, and the trajectory of that ovoid, that ellipsis, that orbit is directly through this sort of oblique plane, right? So as I'm keeping my shin straight and I'm reaching over that foot, I'm feeling the tension from the thumb web of my hand up through my forearm, into my lat, into my opposite side glute as I keep that shin over the floor, and then into the arch of my foot and my big toe, my first metatarsal head. So it's not a front to back movement. It's not a side to side movement. It's this oblique movement that exists on this axis. So I'm like, I'm shifting frontal, transverse, and sagittal the entire time. And that movement is almost like my loaded side hip moves back to the corner of the room. And as I come up, I'm moving to the other. It's very oblique in the plane of motion. So I like that one because I'm thinking ahead. We're going to have a hinge movement that is heavy but constrained, because my lat movement or my upper back movement of choice is going to be a pronated grip bent over barbell row. So I'm looking ahead to that hinge position, and that's going to pick up some of my erectors. It's going to force me in this like kind of isometric position. It's going to decrease overall load, right? So when I think glute, I'm thinking about movement quality, I'm going that way, right? So I'm going to go B-stance dumbbell contralateral RDL for the glute. You're getting a good stretch, probably one of the better stretches other than maybe a step up. You're getting a lot of movement quality, but you're also kind of keeping some gas in the tank, because something like a leg press is going to be, full send and have a high demand and recovery debt. So where are we at? We're at quads for lunges for quads. We're at B-stance RDL, and we're at seated ham for B-stance RDL for the glute, contralaterally loaded with a dumbbell, seated ham for the hamstring. Now the adductor machine, I'm going to kind of rule out. Not that it's bad. I would just prefer a stiff leg deficit hinge. So bilateral stiff leg deficit hinge for the adductors. So I'd much rather train the adductor as an extender of the hip than an adductor of the hip. So one thing that I would rather do, and I want you to see how these are moving parts. If I had chosen an exercise like a leg press for the glutes rather than a B-stance RDL, I may switch my answer from a stiff leg deadlift from a deficit to something like a machine, right? Because I'm trying to ebb and flow these outputs and inputs of like, okay, I'm really paying attention to the loadability of my spine. I want to make sure that my core and my erectors aren't too fatigued, so I run into issues there, knowing full well that I'm going to have this bent over barbell row. Because I look at the bent over barbell row and I'm like, yeah, that's going to be heavy, but it's not going to be conventional deadlift heavy. But I look at the stiff leg and I go, yeah, it's going to be heavy, but it's not going to be conventional deadlift or even RDL heavy. So I have I'm kind of keeping this system of checks and balances with the overall fatigue as I look to stimulate muscle while simultaneously instilling movement quality. So I love the B-stance RDL for just global exposure to the transverse plane, and with that frontal plane movement of the pelvis and internal rotation of the hip. There's just so much going on there that'll help keep our program on the rails as we go through, and we meticulously select the other exercises relative to. So we got from the top, and we're going to keep revisiting this list: seated calf raise shoes on, leg press calf raise shoes off, lunges for quads, seated hamstring curl for hamstrings, obviously, B-stance contralaterally loaded dumbbell RDL for glutes, stiff leg deficit deadlifts for adductors.